For 12 long years, she lived in the shadows, silenced by sickness, rejected by society, and drained of every last hope. No doctor could heal her, no prayer seemed to reach heaven. But then, one day, she saw him, the miracle worker. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't allowed to touch anyone. But desperation has no rules. Pushing through the crowd, she reached for the hem of his robe, her fingers trembling. In that instant, everything changed. But instead of slipping away unnoticed, Jesus stopped. "Who touched me?" All eyes turned to her, the woman no one had seen for years. Would he rebuke her? Would the crowd cast her aside again? Or had her silent faith just rewritten her fate? This moment wasn't just about healing. It was about being seen. Being restored. Being known. She sat alone in the dim light of her small home, staring at the cracked walls that had long mirrored her broken spirit. Dust swirled in the warm air as the city beyond her door bustled with life, children laughing, merchants shouting, footsteps echoing against the stone streets. But here, inside these fragile walls, time stood still. For 12 years, her world had been reduced to this, an existence just outside of life, a presence felt by no one, a name carried on no lips. She had once been a wife, a daughter, a sister, a friend. Now she was only unclean. It had started as little more than a whisper in her body, a gentle inconvenience. She thought it would pass. She thought she would heal. But days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and soon, it was clear, this sickness had no intention of leaving. At first, she had hope. She sought out the physicians, the ones who claimed to understand the mysteries of the body, the ones who promised healing in exchange for silver. They prescribed herbs, rituals, remedies. They swore by their craft. But none of it worked. And so, the silver vanished. The little wealth she had drained away, each coin slipping through her fingers like water, until at last, she was left with nothing but broken promises and empty hands. It was then that the weight of her suffering grew heavier. Because this wasn't just a disease. It was a sentence. The laws were clear, a woman with an issue of blood was to be separated, cast aside, unseen. No one could touch her. No one could sit where she had sat. If she brushed past someone in the streets, they would recoil as if she had cursed them. She wasn't merely sick. She was untouchable. Her life as she had known it was gone. The sickness stole her health, but the law stole her humanity. She could no longer join in the meals, the worship, the embrace of loved ones. The ones who had once called her family now only looked at her with pity, and eventually, stopped looking at all. And so, she became a ghost among the living. Her days were spent in quiet misery, slipping through the edges of the city, scavenging, whispering prayers to a God who seemed deaf to her cries. She had long stopped asking for healing. Now, she only begged for the strength to endure. The worst part was knowing that life went on without her. She could hear it through the thin walls, feel it beyond the locked doors, but she was no longer part of it. The years wore her down like waves against the shore. The woman who had once walked proudly now kept her head down, her body covered, her movements slow. She avoided eye contact, fearing the disgust it would spark. She knew every alleyway, every hidden corner where she could escape the stares. Yet, even in her suffering, something stirred within her. A longing she couldn't silence. A whisper. A desperate hope. She had heard talk, hushed voices drifting through the marketplace, the stories of a man unlike any other. A healer. A miracle worker. A man named Jesus. They said he opened blind eyes with a word, cleansed lepers with a touch, commanded storms with his voice. Some claimed he was the Messiah. Others doubted. She didn't care what title he carried. She only cared if he could do what no one else had done. Could he heal her? Could he restore what had been stolen? For the first time in years, something ignited inside her. A thought, a dangerous thought. What if she found him? She waited, listening closely whenever the merchant spoke of his whereabouts. He was moving from town to town, followed by crowds so vast that he could barely walk through the streets. Then, one day, the word she had been waiting for came: he was here. In her city, she could feel the shift in the air. The excitement. The urgency. People rushed toward the center of town, eager for a glimpse, a word, a miracle. And for the first time in 12 years, she felt something she had long abandoned. She wrapped her worn shawl tightly around her head, pulling it low to conceal her face. She knew the risk: if anyone recognized her, they would drive her away. They would shame her. But what did she have left to lose? She stepped into the streets, her breath uneven, her fingers clutching the fabric around her shoulders. The crowd was dense, the voices loud, the movement chaotic. And in the midst of it all, there he was, Jesus. She could see him, not far, his presence commanding yet gentle, his voice powerful yet full of compassion. She didn't need him to see her. She didn't need him to speak to her. She just needed to touch him. Just the hem of his robe. Surely, that would be enough. And so, she stepped forward, pushing past bodies, squeezing through the spaces between strangers. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to touch anyone. But desperation has no rules. Every step brought her closer. Every movement fueled her hope. She reached out, fingers shaking, breath caught in her chest. And just as he passed, she stretched forward. Her fingers brushed his garment. And in that moment, everything changed. She had long since accepted her fate. 12 years of suffering will do that to a person, draining their hope, dulling their desires, turning even their prayers into routine whispers rather than desperate cries. She had stopped expecting healing. She had stopped dreaming of rescue. Until she heard his name, Jesus. At first, it was just a murmur. A passing conversation between merchants in the crowded marketplace. She wasn't meant to hear it, after all, no one spoke directly to her anymore. But words travel freely, and these words carried something different. It wasn't just talk of another teacher, another preacher declaring truth from dusty roads. No, this was something more. This was power. She listened carefully, keeping her head low, letting the words sink into the marrow of her bones. They spoke of healings: a man who touched lepers and made their skin new, who placed his hands on the blind and restored their sight, who spoke to the lame and made them walk again. Impossible stories. Unbelievable claims. And yet, something inside her believed. Why? She didn't know. Maybe it was because her soul had been starving for hope for so long that she was willing to cling to anything. Or maybe it was because, deep down, something told her this man was different. The whispers grew louder as the days passed. She learned that he had cast out demons, that he had fed thousands with just a handful of bread and fish, that he had calmed storms with only his voice. He wasn't just a healer. He was power itself. She thought of the physicians who had drained her of silver and left her with nothing. She thought of the prayers she had prayed, the sleepless nights spent wondering if God had forgotten her. And then she thought, what if this was her answer? What if Jesus was the one thing standing between her and the life she had lost? The idea lodged itself deep within her, refusing to leave. She began to listen for any sign of his presence. Where he traveled, what he preached, whom he healed. And then, one day, she heard the words she had been waiting for. Jesus is here. Her breath caught in her throat. Here. In her city. Walking these streets. She had waited years for healing. Years for a second chance at life. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. Her heart pounded as she pulled her shawl tighter around her face, obscuring her identity. She knew the risk: stepping into that crowd meant defying every law written about her condition. It meant slipping through the throngs of people, touching bodies that she wasn't supposed to touch, breaking every rule that had kept her imprisoned in loneliness for over a decade. If they recognized her, they would recoil. They would shame her. But fear had lost its grip on her a long time ago. Desperation had taken its place. She stepped into the streets, one trembling foot after another. And there he was, Jesus. Moving through the city, surrounded on all sides by people, pressing, calling, reaching for him. Would he even notice her? Would he care? She couldn't think about that. She couldn't afford to doubt. Because faith wasn't about certainty, it was about movement. And so, she moved. The crowd was thick, bodies pressing from every side, the noise overwhelming. She pushed forward, weaving through men, women, beggars, merchants, each of them clamoring for the same man she had come to find. Her breath was short, her steps unsteady. She wasn't strong. She wasn't bold. She was dying. But she was also determined. Jesus was just ahead, his presence unmistakable. He wasn't like the religious leaders, stiff and unapproachable. He was warm, engaging, filled with a quiet authority that made people draw near. She didn't need him to see her. She didn't need him to stop. She just needed to touch him. Just the hem of his robe. Surely that would be enough. She pressed forward, heart racing, eyes fixed. And just as he passed, she reached out. Her fingers grazed the edge of his garment. And in that instant, everything changed. The moment her fingers brushed against the hem of his robe, it was as if the world stopped. She barely breathed, barely moved, as something unseen but unmistakable surged through her body, warmth, power, restoration. For 12 years, sickness had held her captive. For 12 years, she had woken each morning with pain as her only certainty. For 12 years, she had whispered prayers that never seemed to reach heaven. But in one single instant, everything changed. It was gone. The weight, the agony, the slow decay she had carried for more than a decade, had vanished as suddenly as it had come. Her hands trembled as she touched her own body, feeling something she hadn't known in years. Strength. It was real. She had been healed. She wanted to cry. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to collapse onto the ground and scream in joy. Instead, she turned to leave. She couldn't stay. She hadn't meant to draw attention. She had wanted only one thing, a quiet touch, a silent miracle. She had broken the law simply by being here, pressing through the crowd, brushing against strangers who would recoil if they knew she had touched them. She had no right to demand anything more than the healing she had stolen. She had to go. But just as she stepped back, just as she prepared to slip away unseen, Jesus stopped. That he was walking with purpose, speaking with authority, surrounded by his disciples and the mass of people clamoring for his attention. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, his body stiffened, his eyes narrowed, his head turned as if searching. Someone had touched him. Not just any touch, not the grasping hands of the desperate crowd, not the unintentional brushes of bodies pressed together in the tight streets. This was different. He had felt power leave him. Who touched me? The word sent terror rushing through her veins. No. No, no, no. She had hoped, prayed, that he would keep moving. That the miracle would be enough. That he wouldn't notice. She shrank back, heart pounding, suddenly aware of every glance, every shifting movement in the crowd. The disciples looked at him, confused. Master, the people are pressing all around you. How can you ask who touched you? It was true, hundreds had reached for him, hoping for his attention, his healing, his presence. A touch fueled by faith. Jesus turned slowly, scanning the faces around him, his voice strong but laced with wonder, but Jesus knew the difference between human desperation and divine faith. He kept looking. Searching. The crowd had fallen silent now, eyes darting in curiosity. Someone had touched him in a way that had drawn power from him. And he wouldn't move until he found them. She felt her breath shuddering in her chest. What would he do if he knew it was her? Would he rebuke her? Would he be angry? Would he remind her that she had broken every rule, every law, that she had stolen healing rather than asking for it? She had taken something without permission. Would he demand it back? She knew she couldn't hide. She could feel his gaze moving across the faces, pulling at her heart, commanding her to step forward. And so, she did the only thing she could. She fell to the ground before him. Her body shook as she knelt, her face pressed to the dust of the road, her voice trembling with fear and awe. She told him everything. How she had suffered. How she had been alone. How she had spent everything searching for a cure that never came. How she had heard of him, how she had believed that even the smallest touch would be enough to heal her. And how, in that moment, it had. She braced herself for rebuke. For rejection. For judgment. But instead, Jesus smiled. His voice, filled with tenderness and power, rang out over her. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. For 12 years, she had been called many things. Unclean. Unworthy. Untouchable. But for the first time in over a decade, she was called something different. Daughter. She had stolen healing, but he had freely given something greater, restoration. She hadn't just been healed. She had been seen. And now, she could go in peace. The moment her fingers touched the hem of his robe, something surged through her body, unseen yet undeniable. It wasn't merely warmth or relief. It was power. It raced through her veins, flooding every fragile part of her, undoing the agony that had bound her for 12 long years. One breath, and she knew. She was healed. Her trembling hands reached to touch herself, as if to confirm what she already felt, strength returning, pain vanishing, weakness melting away. For the first time in over a decade, her body belonged to her again. She wanted to cry, to laugh, to collapse in joy, but she knew she couldn't stay. This miracle had to remain silent. She had broken every law just by being here, touching him, pressing through the crowd. She had stolen healing. And now, she had to disappear before anyone noticed. She turned to leave, stepping back, her heart pounding with both exhilaration and fear. Then, Jesus stopped. The crowd had been moving forward, surrounding him, hanging onto his every word, but suddenly, he wasn't walking anymore. His body stilled, his gaze sharpened, his presence shifting from a calm teacher to something more, something searching. His voice, steady but filled with undeniable power, rang through the murmuring masses. Who touched me? Silence fell. The question was absurd. They were pressed against him on all sides. Dozens, hundreds, had reached for him, hoping for just a moment of his attention. His disciples, confused, exchanged glances before one of them spoke. Master, the people are crowding around you and pressing against you. It was true. Everywhere he went, people pressed closer, hands grasping, bodies pushing. How could he possibly ask who touched him? But Jesus wasn't talking about the hands reaching for him in curiosity or admiration. He was talking about a touch that had drawn power from him. A touch fueled not by desperation, but by faith. And he would not move forward until he found the one who had done it. She froze. Fear swelled in her chest. She knew what would happen if they discovered her. The crowd would turn on her. They would shrink away, disgusted, angry. She had defied the law. She had touched them when she wasn't supposed to. She had stolen something from him without asking. What would he do if he knew? Would he take it back? Would he shame her for breaking the rules? Or worse, would he ignore her, just as the world had done for 12 long years? Her heart thundered in her ears, her breath shaky, her hands gripping the fabric of her robe. She could try to disappear. She could slip away before anyone saw her. But something held her there. Something in his voice. Something in his searching. He wouldn't stop until he found her. And so, she did the only thing she could do. She stepped forward. And fell to the ground before him. The world seemed to blur as she knelt in the dust, trembling, her head bowed low, her fingers clutching the earth beneath her. She couldn't lift her eyes to meet his. She could barely speak. Her voice, fragile but desperate, broke the silence as she told him everything. How she had suffered. How she had lost everything. How she had spent all she had searching for a cure that never came. How she had heard of him. And how she had believed that just touching the hem of his robe would be enough to make her whole again. Her confession lingered in the air, thick with anticipation. Would he rebuke her? Would he remind her that she had broken the law? Would he turn away as so many others had done before him? She braced for judgment. For rejection. For silence. But instead, Jesus smiled. His voice, filled with both tenderness and unshakable power, rang out over her. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. For 12 years, she had been called many things. Unclean. Unworthy. Invisible. But now, she was called something new. Daughter. She hadn't just been healed. She had been seen. She had been restored. She had stepped forward in fear, expecting condemnation, but instead, she had found acceptance. And now, she could go in peace. She had prepared for rejection. She had braced herself for judgment. For 12 years, shame had clung to her like a second skin, a weight she carried with every step, every glance, every whispered conversation that was never meant for her ears. She had stepped forward trembling, expecting to be reminded of who she had been, unclean, unworthy, unseen. And yet, Jesus had called her something else. Daughter. The word settled deep in her bones, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. When had she last been called something that wasn't a curse? When had she last been spoken to with kindness rather than disgust? For the first time in 12 years, she wasn't just healed. She was whole. The crowd, once caught in the whirlwind of their own needs and desires, had fallen silent. They had expected the teacher to reprimand her. To remind her that she had broken the law. That she had stolen healing rather than asking for it. But instead, Jesus had affirmed her. She wasn't a mistake. She wasn't an afterthought. She wasn't invisible. Her faith had done what years of medicine could not. It had moved the heart of God. She knelt there in the dust, overwhelmed, struggling to find words. What could she possibly say in response? A lifetime of pain had been erased in a single moment. How could she express the depth of that miracle? But she didn't need to. Jesus wasn't looking for explanations. He wasn't looking for apologies. He had given her something that went beyond healing. He had given her peace. The streets, once suffocating with their crowds and noise, suddenly felt different. Lighter. Freer. For years, she had lived hidden in the shadows, avoiding stares, dodging judgment. But today, she walked forward. Not as an outcast. Not as a forgotten woman. But as someone seen by the Savior himself. And that, she knew, would change everything. For 12 years, she was forgotten, outcast, unseen, silenced by suffering. But in a single moment, with the touch of Jesus' robe, everything changed. Not only was her body healed, but her identity was restored. She had reached in faith, and he had not just healed, he had affirmed. Jesus doesn't just notice the crowd, he notices individuals. And no matter how invisible, broken, or cast aside someone feels, he sees them. And he is always within reach. This is more than just a story from the past. It is a lesson that echoes into the present, an invitation to step forward in faith, to trust that even when the world turns away, Jesus never does. Her story asks us one simple but powerful question. What is your fear keeping you from reaching for? If this story spoke to you, share it. If you feel unseen, reach out to Jesus in faith. And if you want more powerful biblical narratives that inspire, transform, and ignite faith, subscribe to our channel. We are bringing the stories of Scripture to life, one gripping testimony at a time. So hit that subscribe button, like this video, and let's continue uncovering the powerful journeys of the women of the Bible.